records. Okay.
Thank you so much. So this is the signal to once again say a warm, warm welcome to all of you joining us here today for this webinar with Dr. Bayo Akomolafe. And it's really a great pleasure and a great honor to welcome you, Dr. Akomolafe, to this webinar. You see, this webinar is a joint collaboration between Tema Genus, the gender studies unit at Linköping University. It's Eco and Bioart lab, headed by Marietta Radomska, and the Posthumanities hub, for which Marietta is actually also co-director. And it's kind of a team effort behind this particular webinar. You see, we have the Tema Genus coordinator team, which consists of PhD student Isabel Garcia Velasquez, Marietta Radomska, and myself, Cecilia Åsberg. And we would also like to acknowledge the really transcultural or transnational accomplishment that enables this particular webinar, because we would also like to thank Vu Trong, who is hailing from Vietnam right now. So it's a great honor to welcome you all here and to welcome Dr. Bayo Akomolafe. And to give you a little bit about the story, why we invited and are so happy to have Professor Akomolafe with us. You see, in the Posthumanities Hub group team, we were discussing and plotting and planning what the speakers would be for the spring sessions. And then it turned out that there is quite a fan club for your work, Bayo, within our group. And it was really thanks to Tobias Barucha's insistence that we invite you. And Tobias is a master student working at Uppsala University that you've been visiting before. So we are so happy that this was possible, that you accepted. And also, I should mention that Dr. Akomolafe is also part of the advisory board now of the Posthumanities Hub, and we are so happy about that. Now, we are really excited to hear more about your work, and I would also like to introduce to all of you whom haven't had the chance really to see that wonderful website of Bayo Akomolafe. If you haven't, you really should, and read up more about the Emergence Network. And there's a lot more, but Marietta, you will give us a little bit of a short insight into
Thank
Dr.
you so
Akomolafe, right?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Cecilia. And it's really an honor to have you, Bayo, here, and to have you all in this webinar. So, what I'm gonna actually, with my cheat sheet here to read and say is really just a little snippet. So I would really recommend and refer you to both Dr. Akomolafe's website, but also to the Emergence Network website. So Bayo Akomolafe, rooted with the Yoruba people in a more than human world, is the father to Alethea and Kaya, the grateful life partner to Ije, son and brother. A widely celebrated international speaker, post-humanist thinker, poet, teacher, public intellectual, essayist, and author of 2 books, These Wilds Beyond Our Fences, Letters to My Daughter on Humanity's Search for Home, out with North Atlantic Books, and We Will Tell Our Story, The Lions of Africa Speak. Bayo has been visiting professor at Middlebury College, has taught at Sonoma State University, California, Simon Fraser University, Vancouver, Canada, and Schumacher College in England, among other universities around the world. He currently lectures at Pacifica Graduate Institute, California, and University of Vermont. He's also professor of practice at Middlebury College, along with EJ, where he has been especially invited to create a decoloniality project and teach on his concepts of nomadic raciality and blackness as access or becoming black. He sits on the board of many organizations, including Science and Non-Duality, Unache Sanctuary, and more. As a visionary founder and elder of the Emergence Network and chief host of the widely popular online-offline course festival series, We Will Dance with Mountains, Dr. Akomolafe curates an Earth-wide project for the recalibration of our ability to respond to civilizational crises, a project framed within a material feminist, post-humanist, post-activist ethos, and inspired by Yoruba indigenous cosmologies. And I think without further ado, I will just pass the baton to you, Bayo, and the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That was a long one. I was waiting. When would this bio reading end? Thank you for sharing and making me feel welcome. And I greet you all. I see some faces on my screen. I'm waving. Please wave back just to know that we're not robots that have been planted by Cecilia and Marietta. There you go. There you go. You're alive and breathing. I greet you, and I feel very welcome here, and also excited to be part of the new Posthumanities Hub as a member of the advisory board, and just excited to just do stuff with you guys and this Swedish conspiracy that is this gathering. I see some people that I know. I see Tobias. Hey, brother. How are you doing?
How's it going? I'm good. I'm good. I'm very excited to see you.
Good, good. Good to see you here. Good to see you here. See, where I come from, we're a very participatory culture. There's this call and response dynamic that is always present. And so I would invite you, as much as you're able to witness this presentation, which is not supposed to relegate you to an audience, but is supposed to invite you to think along with me and think along with very seditious and sometimes difficult thoughts. All right. And why we're here is to make room for the impossible together, to make room for the impossible, especially now at the end of the world, right? The end of the world as we know it. We need to think dangerous thoughts. We need to travel. We need to leave our comfort zones. We need to rehabilitate our politics of safety. We need to do new things, but that's not so easy, is it? Because sometimes the new is just a reiteration of the old, right? So that's what we want to do together. And I invite you to travel with me, okay? So we're going to do one ritual to begin. Okay, just a ritual to make you slightly uncomfortable, okay? Because I know you're perched behind your screens, comfortable in your houses or your offices, and I want to make you slightly uncomfortable because that's what this is all about, making you slightly uncomfortable, moving you to a different ethnography of care and possibility. So I would like everyone to unmute themselves. If you have the power to do that, please unmute yourself. We're unmuting ourselves, such vulnerability. Exposing us.
Love it.
Okay. I would like you to say what I invite you to say. So I said that the Yoruba people have a storytelling tradition in which the storyteller initiates this call and response dynamic. It goes like this, hello, and then everyone responds, hello. And I don't want to translate that to English, but I will try. The meaning, and language isn't always about meaning, it's about materializing reality. But in a sense, the meaning of that is, can I tell you guys a story? And everyone responds, tell us a story, basically. And I'm going to be telling lots of stories. So I would like to initiate you into the Yoruba people by inviting you to respond Alo. Okay? I will say alo, and you have to shout it. I know it's not European or polite to shout that way, but I would like you to break through the comfort or the politeness of your environment and shout alo. Okay? I'm taking it up. You're bringing it down. Okay, let's do it 3 times. Alo, you do it.
Alo.
Hello.
Excellent, excellent. How do you feel? You feel
Better,
warlike.
better.
You feel better? Okay, 2 more times. 2 more times. Alo, do it.
Alo.
Excellent. That was a bit shaky. For the last one, let's blow up the roof, okay? So I say alo, and you say alo, okay? You're bringing it down. We're landing, we're grounding ourselves in these materialities, okay, together. Alo.
Hello.
Yes, finally. Please applaud for yourselves. Yes. And mute yourselves now. I'm done with you. You can mute yourselves. Thank you so much for participating.
Thank you.
It's my way of entering into the storytelling space. And I like to tell a story. Now, I prepared some slides. I've been speaking a lot these days. I don't usually go for slides, but yeah, it's easier these days to focus my tendency to traipse off my coordinates. So I would like to discipline my speaking by using these slides. And I want to tell a story by starting out with the slides that I've prepared with such care and delicacy for you guys. And like I say, every time I speak, you're not going to see more beautiful slides than these. These are exquisitely prepared for you. My talk is titled Making Sanctuary in the Afrocene. And I want to start with a story. It's a story of Hathor at the end of the world. Hathor at the end of the world. Hathor and the end of the world. Growing up in Africa, in Nigeria to be specific, I usually observed my parents, specifically my dad, performing what we know as libations. You may not know what a libation is, and you might have heard of what libations are. Libation is the ritual of pouring drink to the earth. It could be wine, it could be beer, sometimes even water, but it's this ritualized practice of pouring fluid, drink, to the earth as a way of blessing a gathering, right? We have many rituals for inviting people to convene, right? My father used to break kola nuts. I don't know if you know what a kola nut is, but they would break it. And the Igbo people in Eastern Nigeria, it's such a spiritual fruit. To break open the kola nut is to welcome hospitality from the gods, from ecologies, from spirits. So my father used to pour libations, and I used to watch elders pour it. And I used to wonder to myself, what a perfectly horrible waste of wine this is. You see, because I was educated, and to be educated is to be politically excluded from your own indigenous realities. You're not just educated within literacy or speaking and writing, you're educated out of a different world. These are the tensions that exist, within the socio-materialities we occupy. So I was educated out, and I felt this was nonsensical. Why pour wine to the earth? And then that changed quickly when I learned about the story of the libations. You see, there's this story that comes from, the story I tell you now comes from ancient Egypt, which was then known as Kemet. And the story is told about the god Ra. Ra is a powerful god, but on this day, when all the trouble begins, he's not so powerful, at least given appearances. Ra is found drunk, drinking wine in front of a temple and just wasting away his life. I don't know how gods waste away their lives, but Ra was certainly doing it. And then men, women, children, people would pass by and make fun of Ra, point at him and mock him to his face. Ra had had enough. And so he decided, I'm gonna go back to heaven and discipline humankind, right? Which is a thing you do when you have so much power. And so he stomps off to heaven, arrives, and he's thrown a fit, and he's angry. And his wife, Hathor, who's also his mother, who's also his sister, don't ask me how, shows up and says, what's wrong, my lord? What's happening? Why are you so angry? Those humans, they did horrible things to me. They made fun of me. Hathor says, well, not to worry. I will take care of them. And so Ra grants permission to Hathor to leave no stone unturned to destroy all of humankind. And so Hathor takes her job seriously, right? And she traverses the gap, the chasm between heaven and earth, arrives on earth and starts to decimate human populations, basically ripping apart flesh from flesh, tearing apart bodies, sucking on blood, right? It's a horrible scene. And there's nothing we can do to stop Hathor. Everything we throw at Hathor ends up getting wasted. She's like a storm, a giant that cannot be faced with a toothpick or something like that. She's just immense and commodious and archetypal in her primordial fury. And every night, what Hathor would do would be, she would suck all the blood, the puddles of blood on the landscape, leaving no land, wet with blood. And then she would retire for the day, go to sleep, and continue the next day. And so people start to pray to Ra and like, forgive us, we're so sorry, we made a horrible mistake making fun of you. Please stop this rampage. But Ra himself cannot stop it. Ra doesn't know what to do because Ra is like, Hathor, okay, come back home. But Hathor cannot listen. She's so furious. She's so angry that she cannot be controlled. She cannot be reined back in. She's like climate change, if you will. And then the gods and humankind come together. They come to a conference, possibly sponsored by the Posthumanities Hub. And they gather together and they start asking questions about their moment. They start asking questions about what's happening. And I think the story goes that a child stands up. It's always a child. Wisdom always out of the mouth of babes. A child stands up and says, what if we trick Hathor? What if we trick her? What do you mean? Speak up, speak up. What if we pour wine, red wine, on the earth and trick Hathor into thinking that's blood? And then when she drinks it, she gets drunk and forgets what she's supposed to be about. Such, that's the kind of proposal that will come out of the mouth of a 5-year-old. But there's no other solution. There's nothing else for anyone to do, no other bright ideas. Gods and humans are at a loss for what to do. So they follow the child and they plan out this conspiracy and they pour red wine on the earth. And Hathor comes in the morning and she's like, I thought I drank this yesterday night. Okay. And she drinks up, she licks up all the wine and she gets really drunk because it's really tough wine. And then she forgets her whole entire objectives and goes to sleep. And my people, that is how the world is saved, so to speak. And so it is said that we continue the tradition of pouring wine to the earth to remember that we are sustained by a trick, that sometimes solutions will get in the way of transformation, that sometimes we need to outthink our thinking, that sometimes it will take more than humans to address the issues of our time. It would take a post-human, more than human affair to address the issues that confront us as a species. Right? Did you get the story? Do you understand the story? And I tell the story about libations at this time because it seems we are also at critical edges. We are at an end of world scenario. And we're at a time when we're being invited into spillage, into thinking about the way we think and seeing the way we see and pausing, if you will, not rushing forward into the solutionisms that we're used to. So the story of libations I write here, and I'm going to be jumping from text to poetry to story and to readings sometimes as I trace out the contours of what I call making sanctuary. The story of libations and its telling now at this critical juncture in modern history is significant because it deposits us at the critical edges where old gods and all our human ingenuity are at a loss as to what to do about modern crises. We've been struggling, and Cecilia knows this, and Marietta knows this, and Tobias knows this, and Jana knows this, that we've been struggling with coming to terms with the issues of climate chaos since the 1970s. And we don't know exactly what to do about it. We're very educated about what is at stake, but it seems we're still stuck in the same dynamic of repeating the familiar. And this is why I speak about libations, and this is why I speak about making sanctuary. Making sanctuary is, just to start things out in a soft way, is a fugitive code for slowing down in times of crisis. Making sanctuary is about wading in the water. If you know anything about the old Negro spirituals that came out from the antebellum South in the United States, right? About wading in the water, the songs about hiding as an epistemology, not as a shirking of courage, but as an animism that presses our bodies with ecologies. Making sanctuary is about leaving the plantation. It's about tracing a genealogy of the new, what Deleuze would call difference, what you would call flights away from circuitous flows. It's about a flowering at the edges of borders that are supposedly closed. I'm writing a novel, and don't tell anyone I'm doing this, guys. Don't tell anyone. I see all your faces. I know where you live. I will find you, okay? Don't tell anyone I'm doing this. I'm writing a novel about a woman in the pandemic that starts to sprout flowers from her skin, right? She starts to become monster in a sense. And it's a beautiful epic that crystallizes my ideas about what it means to surround sites of trouble, to gather, underneath reddened skies where gods do not know what to do any longer, and we no longer know who to pray to, right? This is about an animism that transforms us and makes us monsters. This is making sanctuary. So let's go into it, what I mean by this, by tracing out, and touching the contours of it a little bit. Let's begin, like I say, at the end of things. And I think to some extent, many of us would agree that it feels we're at an end of world scenario. But the end of things for me is always an invitation to the middle, right? An end is always a middle. Whether you're speaking about the Atlantic middle, the middle passage of the transatlantic slave trade that lasted 400 to 500 years, we are being drawn by the gravitational pull of the middle, the dense middle. And here I put the picture of an ant that has been infested and infiltrated by a fungal pathogen called Ophiocodiceps unilateralis, which is a neural parasite that infects the ant to do something that it doesn't want to do, and then sprouts alien satellite from its head that becomes a fungal station. It just reminds me, I like this picture is on my desktop. It reminds me about the alienness of our times, how we are exceeded by a more than human world that cradles human intentionality. We might think we're doing everything that we want to do, but I think the invitation of the post-human is to reconsider our centrality, is to notice that there are other forces that are at work, and we have to find ways of meeting them, encountering them so deeply that we lose our own way And as my people say, until we lose our way, we will continue to become stuck. In order to find your way, you must become lost. Let's get into it. In 2007, I don't know how many of you like football. Can't see any hands, so probably none of you. Oh, Cecilia loves football. Sweden is a footballing nation? Is it? Plays football, attends the World Cup? Okay. Is Sepp Blatter Swedish? Is he Swedish? I don't know.
Who?
Sepp Blatter, the man on your screen right now.
No.
Who was
No.
once the FIFA president? Okay, he's
Flatten is.
not. He's okay. Okay, I don't know where he's from, but I forget where he's from, but he's European, obviously. Well, here is Sepp Blatter announcing, to the great joy of Brazil, that Brazil was going to host the 2014 FIFA World Cup. This happened in 2007, okay? And it was such a big deal. I think it's a big deal for any nation to win the hosting rights. It's like you've been granted access to the future, right? It's like a king has stretched its scepter to you and says, go, develop, do great things, build new stadiums and new bridges and new roads. And Brazil, they were quite happy. I'm not saying Brazil is a monolith, right? There were, of course, lots of people that criticized and still criticize the techno machine that is FIFA. FIFA is not just a sport machine, it's a political terraforming planetary machine, right? Basically, anywhere the football game gets into, it changes, and it leads to loss and displacement and extractivism and computational capitalism. Well, that's another story. But Brazil, at least the officials, were very happy because it meant they could build a bridge to the future, to tomorrow. And so what they started to do was they embarked on a building spree. You know, they built $100 million museum of tomorrow. I've actually visited there. I was privileged to be led and curated by its director through the entire museum. And I did a small documentary there, a small talk. Brazil started to build, started to break the ground and expand its roads. And it was like nothing could stop this moment. They could build whatever they wanted. They could finally join the industrial powers that be and claim their space in the future. But if you've heard that song by Phil Collins, Something Happened on the Way to Heaven, that's exactly what happened here. Something happened on the way to heaven. Because the story goes that as the construction crews and tractors and machines were drilling into the earth, they inadvertently, accidentally unearthed bones belonging to slaves. Thousands of slaves, crushed bones, artifacts, like I write here, shrapnel from a different temporality, piercing the unbothered continuity of the future, right? It was as if the haunting past or the ghostly and ghastly past that Brazil was trying to get rid of to rush into a post-racial techno future was temporarily postponed by this archaeological find, right? And I have some pictures there of bones that they put together and slave plantations, putting that diffractively with the image of the museum that was trying and yearning for tomorrow. These are pictures that I gathered on the internet of those bones. I love the New York Times title. It says, Real's Race to Future Intersects Slave Past. It's like the slave, the difficulty, the ghastly nature of slave temporalities pierced through that unbothered notion that they could build a highway to the future. On the bottom right of the screen, you could see the artifacts from the slaves that were brought out from that archaeological find, combs and trinkets of different kinds. But you see, these ruptures, as sudden and as shocking as they were part of a series of eruptions in the site of Valongo. It's called the Valongo Wharf, or Caisto Valongo, and it's said to be the largest port in the Americas for the reception of slaves. Brazil received more slave bodies, more Black bodies than any other port on the planet. Millions of people passed through that port. The lady on your screen is a friend of mine. Her name is Mercedes Guimaraes. In 1996, she bought a house on Valongo Street. And she started to embark on renovations. This was a couple of years before Brazil won the hosting rights and they made those discoveries, right? Mercedes bought this house on Valongo Street and started to renovate the place. In her backyard, as they were unearthing things and breaking through the concrete to plant new surfaces, the workers started to find bones. And so they started to joke that maybe the person that lived in this house, the prior owner, was a killer, which was just a joke, was a murderer. They were just joking. But with more and more bones dug out, Mercedes started to feel that something was wrong. Her first intuition was that these were bones of cats and dogs. But it soon came to light that her house was built on a cemetery, a dumping ground for thousands of Black bodies that did not make it into the hinterlands, did not make it into the plantations. They were so sick that when they arrived at the wharf of Valongo, their dead bodies were dumped with thousands of other bodies in the place that is now the wharf of Valongo. And her house was on a major part of this dumping ground. And I'm talking about children. I'm talking about mothers and fathers dumped and squeezed and crushed into a tiny space, not even given the dignity of a proper burial. Yes, the story always gets me. And you can see on the other part of my screen, the renovation efforts. This is a picture by Mercedes. So one of the researchers, Mercedes, was worried about what was happening. And so she called researchers from a university, and they confirmed her suspicions, her growing suspicions, that these were not the bones of cats and dogs. These were human bones, slave bones, Black bones. And a particular set of bones was said to have belonged to a 20-year-old woman that the researchers named Bakita. Bakita also happens to be the name of a saint, a Sudanese slave that was made a saint by the Catholic Church. They gave this fugitive bone or set of bones the name Bakita. And you can see Bakita's bones to the left of the screen, and some of the researchers in their probing, they're digging into the earth. That's Bakita right there. Now, I bring to you Bakita, and I'm introducing Bakita to you because I always think about Bakita. In fact, I have a major research project that is called the Bakita Project that is about congregating around that wound in the earth. So what Mercedes has done is she refused to cover the graves. She built her house and made it into a museum called the Museum for the Arriving Blacks. And it's the only museum on the planet that is dedicated to the memory of those crushed bones, those bodies that couldn't make it into the plantations. The only one. And in 2020, we partnered with Mercedes to create We Will Dance with Mountains and to dedicate it to the memory of Bakita, right? So I always think about Bakita and I wonder, what would justice look like for Bakita? You know, what legislation can the European Parliament or the World Health Organization or the United Nations put in place to meet the demands of justice that Paquita represents, right? What would the future look like if Paquita were included in it? Is there a space in Brazil's future, the future that it was rushing to build? Was there a space for Paquita to live in? But in staying with these troubling questions, I realized that Paquita wasn't seeking justice after all, that it was justice that put her beneath the ground. Justice put Paquita, sedimenting her beneath layers of aspirations, beneath layers of post-racial aspirations, beneath the ground, and stored her there. How could I say such a horrible thing? Justice is supposed to be the rightness and the righteousness of everything. But I'm saying that justice is a secretion of a public order, an arrangement of bodies that is subsidized by bones, subsidized by things that are invisibilized, things that we would rather push away. It wasn't justice that broke through. Instead, Paquita broke through justice to make a stunning claim that I think would be very difficult for many people to hear today. And that is that the future is not enough and justice is not enough. In many senses, Paquita is a ghost of the modern civilization. By ghost, I don't mean something that goes, ooh, I don't mean that. That's a Hollywoodized notion of ghosts. I don't mean Ghostbusters. I don't mean the specter down the hallway. By ghosts, I mean the ecstasy of bodies. In fact, I've started to stop referring to bodies as bodies. I've started to refer to bodies as body ways. And that is my way of stating or claiming that bodies do not precede their movements. Bodies and movements are indistinguishable. Bodies are ethnographical, cartographical projects. Tobias is not just the bearded dude on my screen right now. Tobias is an assemblage of aspirations, of archetypes, of microbial activations, of concepts to come. He is spread out. No self is as enclosed as our modern imperial imaginations help us believe they are. Selves are spread out. They are rhizomatic, right? So that's how I think of ghosts, as more than individuals, right? In a sense, Paquita was disturbing the project of justice, justice as a project of the state, justice as a project of rectilinear orders, justice as a product of progress, justice as a secretion of the Anthropocene. She was stating, and she is stating in the crack that has enveloped the ground in Kaisto Valongo, she is stating that I do not want to be included in your future, and I will not be named, I will not be captured. Justice is not enough. Your justice is not enough. Your future has no place for me. I reject your future. And the whole purpose of this invitation to make sanctuary is to stay with the trouble of that, to quote Donna Haraway, to stay with the trouble of Paquita's voice, of Paquita's polyvocality. Today, we are at the end of the world. I don't need to take you guys through the drill. You know the drill. You know that face there. I don't need to mention him. Well, I will, just in case you don't. Putin, right? These are the images that are sustaining the narrative that we have come to an impasse, that we've come to a dead end. It's not just the doomsday clock calibrated to annihilation. It's not just the IPCC report of 2021 and 2022 basically saying the shit has hit the fan. It's not just the pandemic of the COVID virus and disease that is upending the public and how we move through the public and how we greet other bodies. You know, It's also the threat of World War III. It's also the disabilities that are shaking our assumptions of stability. So we are at a very critical place right now. Many people think of these end of world scenarios as part of what some geologists would call the Anthropocene. And I'm sure you've heard of that many, many times. I'm sure Cecilia has written 101 articles about the Anthropocene, and Marietta is probably writing a book, an encyclopedia about the Anthropocene. Everyone seems to know about the Anthropocene. It's the planetary cautionary tale that says everything has gone wrong. We all need to get back to order, or else we're in trouble. The Anthropocene is also this political imaginary that basically asks that everyone's hands need to be on deck. Anthony needs to get off his couch. Yes, I'm speaking to you, Anthony. Anthony needs to literally get out of his couch and do something about the Anthropocene, because we're harming the planet, it says the meta-narrative. We're harming the world. So switch off the lights, stop eating meat, whatever, do whatever you can to stop the greenhouse emissions that, you know, is contributing to the warming of the planet and to the escalation of despair and trouble. But you see, tracing this idea, this trouble, and I want you to stay with this voice that is Bakita, this rupture through the modern, this rupture through justice, this rupture that breaks through the highway and constitutes a pothole, you know, an impediment in an obstacle, if you will, in our desires to just reach the future and to solve all our problems. I want you to stay with that and keep it close as I walk my way through this. The Anthropocene is the way we're cradling and understanding the end of the world, right? But I'm insisting that this paradigm, this response paradigm, lacks imagination. And here are some reasons. One of them is that it re-centralizes the human. It bases responsivity and responsibility on human intentionality. Basically, it says Marietta needs to get off, you know, the couch and do something, but it doesn't really account for the agency, the polyvocality, the contributions of the more than human world. It ironically, you know, tends to circle back to the human individual as the fulcrum, the source of imagination, the source of agency, the source of change. And in doing so, it re-centralizes identity in a troubling way that I shall explore if I have the time. Another thing that it does is that it leads to a compulsory ableism of solutions. And I'm a psychologist, trained as a psychologist, recovering from my training. I know about the ableism of solutionism that I speak about. It's the clinical gaze, you know, the therapeutic alliance in which the therapist meets eye to eye in interpersonal encounters his client. And basically within that interpersonal alliance, healing is supposed to sprout. And in a sense, we're trying to do the same thing with climate chaos, with the pandemic, with all our anthropocenic troubles. We're dragging them out of their dark and shadowy places, and we're sitting them in front of the in a Freudian couch, and we're trying to establish interpersonal therapeutic alliance in the clinical gaze, except this thing in front of us is not human, it's alien, and it has eyes everywhere, so we don't even know where to look. And in a sense, the paradigm lacks imagination because of its notion of harm. Most of the time, I think this is quite pervasive these days in the pandemic, when we're asked to reduce harm by wearing masks. And in my family, we all wear masks. Reduce harm by getting vaccinated. And we are of that tribe too, as well. except that the idea that we reduce harm or we can address the pandemic by getting vaccinated is another reiteration of modern imagination, is another rush to the individual. I think of it as an incarceration, right? Because if there's one thing that the pandemic did, it disrupted the idea that my health belongs to me. It made Cecilia's health also my health because it merged our bodies together. And suddenly, you know, that was disturbing and scandalous to modern ideas of individuality. And so vaccinations are also part of geometries of harm because they rush us back into our industrial selves, our consumerist selves, and tells us, let's get back to normal, guys. Let's get back to the normal we once knew so that we can get this world running again as we once understood it, right? So what I say here is harm is more than just subject versus object. Harm is a politics. And in our attempt to rush everyone back to normal these days, it seems we are only proliferating a politics of harm. The paradigm of the individual that led to the virus in the first place. The Anthropocene as a geological and political and spiritual concept also lacks imagination because it does not account for the idea that the mind is more than human. James Human was an archetypal psychologist, and he was of the persuasion that the psyche is beyond the human self, right? The psyche is ecological. And in a sense, he was, you know, embodying this idea of the anima mundi, this notion that everything is alive, this invitation not to resituate agency within the human self. I think we are at a crisis point where mind has been dislodged from its perch, but we do not know how to sit with that crisis. We're trying everything we know, throwing blueprint upon blueprint, you know, photo ops, Obama, you know, climate conferences, flying across the world, new legislation, and we're still stuck. And this is because the Anthropocene is an ethnography of restoration, of the sanctity of the public order. I'm going to say that again, slowly this time. The Anthropocene is doing the work of trying to get us back to the normal we once knew, because it comes out of an understanding of the individual as the agential center of the universe. The Anthropocene is the ethnography of restoration. I hope this is making sense. Guys, if this is making sense to you, just wave your hands in the air and wave them like you just don't care. Good. That's all the hip hop I know. Let's go ahead. There's another problem with the Anthropocene as a concept, and I think it explains why we're stuck. It's the problem of the royal we. The royal we. It basically says, everybody, this is our problem. Let's solve this. We have to save ourselves. We have to save the planet. And then comes the piercing rebuttal. Who is we? Who got us here in the first place? And so there are lots of critical attempts to frame what some might call the African Anthropocene, because the Anthropocene does not do a good job at noticing and emphasizing the legacies of industrialization, the legacies of displacement and colonization, the imperial structures that have been planted in indigenous societies. It doesn't do a good job at naming those things, right? It just says we must solve the problem. It doesn't really stick with the many communities that have been invisibilized by this royal we. And so the African Anthropocene as a term is often submitted as a corrective concept, right? And what it tries to do is to say, no, there's no we here. Mineral resources, human bodies, millions, I think 12 million, were taken across centuries, you know, across the Atlantic to the so-called New World. Europe was built on the riches of these displacements. The industrial order is premised on these losses. We cannot address the future without addressing these ghosts. You have to stay with the ghosts of these moments before you rush off into solutions. And it's a very striking concept, this notion of the African Anthropocene. However, that also has its own problems, because I think that the African Anthropocene depends heavily on the industrial. It doesn't go far enough, as I would like it to. So where would I like the concept to go to? I would like it to start by addressing what I call the Afrocene. The Afrocene. So let's talk a bit about the Afrocene by referring back to Bakita. Remember Bakita? I hope you haven't forgotten Bakita. Bakita is, this is Nahum Chandler. Professor Nahum Chandler speaks about para-ontology, which is the disability of ontology, if you will. If ontology is the study of being, then para-ontology is the disability of being. What is the disability of being? Becoming. That is, being has a disability, and that is becoming. But that's not all that concept has to teach us. But for our purposes, Bakita is the crip. Anywhere you hear the word crip, it refers to crippled, is the crippling of the future. It's the disability of the future, the para-ontology of the future, the underbelly of the modern and of justice. And in that sense, Bakita is a figure of Black geographies. And I'll explain what Black geographies are. Black geographies are, or refer to the disturbance of the idea of a neutral public. Now, that might need some further explanation. If Anthony and I were, Anthony, where are you, by the way? Could you unmute yourself? Where are you in the world? Are you in Brazil? Are you in the Bahamas?
I'm in Northern Ireland.
You're in where? Say that again, brother. I didn't hear you.
Northern Ireland.
Oh, Ireland. Okay. Okay. Imagine we were somewhere in London together, Anthony, and we're just walking the streets. You saw a beautiful tree, and you said, "How beautiful that flowering tree." What you see might be entirely different from what I see because of intergenerational trauma. Because of intergenerational trauma, I might see a technology of lynching. As we know here, one of the practices of dispensing with Black bodies in the antebellum South of the United States was to hang their bodies on trees. And I think these memories did not stick with those dead bodies. They lived on in some ghostly way, and they infected other bodies. This is the topic of intergenerational trauma, which is not my focus here. But my point is just to say that there isn't a neutral, apolitical world in front of us. The world is polyvocal. The world is doing many things at once. It is not just perspectival, it is socio-material in a multi-dimensional way. So that there isn't such a thing, and this is what my brother Marcus Gabriel would say, that there isn't a world, in fact. There isn't a container that could encapsulate all the things about that we experience, and even those things we don't experience. So Black geographies refers to the outdoors, refers to the concepts that disturb the neutral political order, right? Like Bakita. Bakita is a member of Black geographies, so to speak. She's a member of parliament in the Black outdoors. She's not seen. She lives in cracks beneath the modern, right? She doesn't want to be included in society, but she's the very fulcrum. She's the very foundation upon which society is built, right? That's Bakita, and that's Black geographies. So the Anthropocene, and I've said this previously, is this ritual for restoring the public order, except the public order exceeds the public. The haunted public order exceeds the public order and wants to do other things beyond solutions, beyond modern claims to wholeness. So what I'm saying here is that Black geographies exceed the public and invite us to do more things than just find solutions to climate change or fix racial injustice or stop police brutality. There are other things that want to happen, and Bakita and Black geographies are a signal for that, right? I say here that Black geographies posit a haunted public order, and that the Black outdoors disturbs the ideas of an empty public, suggesting multiple troubles where we might look for a singular definition or clarity, right? And I will skip through this. I'll just invite you all to read a short story by Herman Melville. I don't know if you've heard of Herman Melville. It's a story that's called Benito Sereno. It's named after a captain of a slave ship. It's a short story about a slave ship that an American captain boards and witnesses noise, on this slave ship. And he castigates and shouts rudely at the captain of this noisy slave ship, basically telling this Spanish captain to get his slave ship into order. What's wrong with you? Why is everything so noisy here? Put everything in order. What that captain does not know and realize is that the noise is actually a conspiracy of the slaves to commandeer the slave ship and return it to Africa, right? So what the captain heard as noise was deep intelligence, right? And this is Herman Melville. It's a very beautiful story. And I think it's a story that could help us understand what is happening today. That most of what we see as politics, Ukraine versus Russia, climate change, the Anthropocene, greenhouse emissions, racial injustice, police brutality, what else? The doomsday clock. All those things that we understand as defining concepts of our time have an underbelly. We are not seeing the post-human excesses that are happening. And Black geographies are the invitation for us to see beyond clarity and to stay with confusion just a little bit more so that we can understand other things that are happening in the world at large. Because if we resituate ourselves within the modern paradigm, we get stuck again and again, right? So the Afrocene, in a sense, is a reading of Black geographies. And I want to say this here. By Black, I don't mean the identity Black. I mean, I often write about Blackness with two cadences. One is Blackness with a capital B. Blackness with a capital B is the identitarian concept of Blackness, right? It is how bodies were transported from Africa and imported into the human and were given a racialized identity, Black, right? My people have a joke that we did not know we were Black until white people came. That's the idea. But Black with a small b is about the counter-imperial forces, the post-human counter-imperial forces that disturbs identity, that haunts identity, that disturbs wholeness and individuality. The screams beneath the slave ship, the bones that are occluded by modern surfaces. That is the Afrocene. The Afrocene is an invitation, to cut the long story short, the Afrocene is an invitation to disability. It's an invitation to stay with cracks, to stay and probably go into the cracks of Bakita, because that's where a new politics might be born. It wants to pause us in our highways, in our search for salvation, and to warn us that salvation will get us into trouble. That if we win the war, for instance, against the pandemic, we've lost, right? If we summarily got rid of the viruses, we've gotten rid of a part of ourselves, ironically. If we win the war against the more than human, then we have only reiterated the paradigm of the human. And that is troubling. So the Afrocene is an invitation to cracks. And I'll just leave this because of time. I wanted to tell a story here about the slave and the crack in the slave ship. But it might just help to go through some of the points in that story. That the Anthropocene is like the slave ship. Modernity is like a slave ship. And then, this slave ship is in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and the waters somehow crack through the hull of the slave ship. And the masters of the slave ship are basically crying out, everyone's hand on deck. Everyone's hands on deck. Let us cover the breach. Let us restore sanctity. Let us get back to the normal. The problem is normal hasn't worked for us. Normal is the slave ship. Why would I want to repair a slave ship, guys? So the Afrocene is like a slave standing in front of these cracks through which water is pouring. And he realizes that he has an affinity to the cracks. He doesn't want to be healed by modernity. He doesn't want to be covered up. He wants to spill like a libation. He wants to do other things. He wants to experiment with death. He wants to travel. He wants to explore the black outdoors. This place where the slave stands is the beginning of the Afrocene and the beginning of what I think of as post-activism. The crack in time, the crack in modern temporality, the crack in Kaisto Valongo, the Bakita grave in the cemetery, right? These are all cracks. These are all miracles that break through the cosmology of the modern. This is the crossroads we're being invited to stay with and to inhabit. What do I mean by cracks? Cracks are dense materialities. They are impersonal flows, territorial materializations of flows. Basically, it's like worlds come together and they cannot contain themselves, so they erupt and explode, right? One way that I usually speak about cracks and how it reformulates all our bodies is referring to the 1945 event of Hiroshima, the bomb blasts in 1945, August 6th and 9th, Hiroshima and Nagasaki respectively. The bomb blasts that ended the World War, so to speak. I don't believe the World War II ended. I think we're still in it, but that's another topic. The bomb blasts of, in Hiroshima and Nagasaki were cracks in space-time. What they did was to reformulate all of us. All of us are still connected to Hiroshima in some way. How? Carbon-14 was dispensed from those explosive encounters. It was pushed into the atmosphere, pushed into the surfaces of water, pushed into the oceans, pushed into our skins. As early as the 1970s, babies were still born, irradiated with their cells with a little bit of carbon-14 from the Hiroshima bomb blasts. I don't know of any studies that have examined whether we're still born with that radiation in our body from Hiroshima till today, but I think we are all connected to that crack. And that is what I mean by cracks. Cracks are, Zizek would call them events. Cracks are explosions that reformulate bodies. They are post-human events that spill through space-time and change everything, right? Perhaps Cecilia fell in love with someone, and forgive me for putting you in the spotlight, Cecilia. Everything that led to that moment of falling in love was defined by that moment. And so you would define your life just like Christians would define a history, before Christ and after death, right? Cecilia might say, when I met this person, everything changed. My life led to this moment, and my life afterwards is defined by this moment. So even falling in love is like a crack, right? So I am saying that this crack is failure. This crack is disabling. Falling in love is a disabling moment. I mean, the term falling is right there in the term. Falling in love is disabling. A crack is a wound. And yet this wound is potentially decolonial. Let me get to the point of all I'm talking about here. And I've said something about the Afrocene and Black geographies. Everything I've said up till now, speaking of the Anthropocene, trying to understand how the Anthropocene is not enough as a concept to understand what is afoot today, trying to process and stay with the idea that there are more than human entities that are like invisible political constituents that are staking their claims to attention and are saying, do not rush forward, do not find a solution, stay with us in this moment, stay with the trouble. Everything I've said leads to this moment. In a sense, my people, we are in a crack today. The pandemic is like a crack. It's changing everything, or has changed everything. 9/11, September 9th, 2001, September 11, rather, 2001 was a crack that changed flights forever. Now we have to remove our shoes and go through the TSA every time you get into the United States of America, right? It changed travel forever. Now, everyone is suspicious of every other person, right? Everyone is potentially a terrorist these days. I feel we're in those days, once again, we're in a crack. This crack gives us two opportunities. One is the potential for restoration. One, and the other is the potential for decoloniality, right? This wound, this crack that I speak of can be understood as a thorn in the flesh. If any of you goes to church, do any of you go to church? Anyone here? Church? Oh, you're all going to hell. Well, you're all going to hell. Good to meet you. We'll all be in hell together. I grew up Christian, but I no longer subscribe to the faith, even though I'm still entangled with it. St. Paul, one of the founders of Christianity, in a sense, speaks about a thorn in its flesh. And many people do not understand what he was referring to. It was quite poetic. They felt it was an enemy, maybe an infirmity, a demon. But every time he prayed, and he wrote in his letters that he prayed to God to get rid of the thorn in his flesh. And that phrase, thorn in the flesh, is now part of popular culture. And God responds to Paul by saying, no, I'm not going to solve this. Stay with it. Stay with this thorn in the flesh. Stay with this opening in your flesh. My grace is sufficient. Oh, that's a hard blow right there, right? There's no therapist that would say that would survive in the profession. God literally says, nah, I'm not fixing this. Stay with the trouble. Stay with this opening. Listen to Bakita, right? So I theorize the thorn in the flesh as the place where an exploding God, so to speak, pierces the flesh, creating cracks that exceed the imperatives of solutions, right? And I'm trying to say that we're getting this all wrong, in a sense, in a manner of speaking, that every time we talk about solving climate change, we are doing a politics of restoration, that there's something else that wants to happen beyond solutions, people, right? So this is what I'm talking about, that there are two things that a thorn in the flesh can give us. Every crack is an explosion, and it births new possibilities. One possibility, as I note here, is healing, restoration, like I said, regeneration, justice. Another one is the politics of shape-shifting and fugitivity and monstrosity. And I want to just to contrast this with these two images I have here. One is of a tadpole. I think these were experiments with electricity in a lab in which some limbs of the tadpole were cut off. And by immersing those tadpole bodies in a field of electricity, the scientists were able to regenerate the lost limbs, right? So imagine I'm a tadpole and someone cuts off my arm. And these people who are doing some stuff with galvanism, practicing electricity, were able to regenerate those limbs. In that sense, a crack is part of a politics that restores the usual, the familiar, the images that we're used to. But there's another ethnographical project that can sprout from cracks, and that is what I call shape-shifting. So that is represented by the second tadpole. And there's this unusual paper that was written, I can't remember the title, but it goes something like this, that some tadpoles were regenerated with eyes on their backs. And I don't mean limbless, useless eyes. I mean eyes that could see. They mutated in the electrical field, and they did not just regenerate the familiar, they became monstrous. So they grew up as frogs with third eyes on their backs. And I'm trying to say here that the decolonial, what we want to be facing right now, is a politics that makes us become different or helps us become different, a politics of different differences. Because I, as a Black body, as a Black ethnography on this planet, with this planet, I am tired of the usual. I am tired of this incarceration. Modernity is built on my bones. The cracks on my back are still stinging with intergenerational loss and trauma and displacement. And we are all caught up in this together. So restoring what we know, getting back to normal, is only reinforcing the sickness. We need an ethnography of shapeshift. And this is what Making Sanctuary is about. Making Sanctuary is post-activism. It asks the question, what if healing becomes sick? Did you get that? Did you hear the irony of that? What if medicine becomes sick in itself? This is not a new concept. People refer to it as iatrogenesis. Iatrogenesis is the medical, is when medical intervention creates the sickness. And I think we're in that toxic cyclicity where our attempts to fix ourselves, to fix the planet, to restore the normal is part of the sickness, right? I was reading a paper, an essay that highlighted the growing numbers of face masks in the ocean. Our attempts to fix the pandemic has created a new network of suffering. Isn't it ironic that in the time of climate change, when we're speaking about ocean acidification, what we produce to respond to the crisis only re-engineers and reinforces ecological loss and damage? So post-activism asks, what if the way we respond to the crisis is part of the crisis? What if healing becomes sick? What if reinforcing the problematic familiar becomes, an issue to stay with? What if we're trapped in particular arrangements of power, right? And so post-activism proposes walking away from the clinical gaze. It proposes attending to sites of trouble. It proposes becoming Black. And yes, I just said becoming Black. I don't mean Marietta would wake up in the morning and suddenly find that she looks exactly like me. That's not what I mean by becoming Black. That's an identitarian becoming Black. I mean losing our way and unlearning colonial mastery. Becoming Black is about becoming fugitive. It's about performing exile from the plantations, from the computational capitalisms that belabor our bodies to produce the familiar. It's about staying with cracks. This is a politics that cradles disability. I call this disability generative incapacitation. It's not dead failure. This failure is doing things. It's the story of my son who, in a manner of speaking, is on the autistic spectrum. He's 4 years old, and he refuses to return our gaze most of the time. He will not look straight at me, right? It's just like the story of Pinocchio, the wooden boy. Most of the time, I find myself desiring my wooden son to become a real boy. And that's why that story is problematic. It's a story of Joseph Campbell's hero's narrative, the hero's journey. That narrative is quite endemic in our attempts to solve our problems, that at the end of the day, we can come out victorious. But there's another story of Pinocchio written by this Soviet author called Alexei Tolstoy, who is related, I think, to Leo Tolstoy. It's called The Golden Key or The Adventures of Buratino. And I love this story. It's a different take on Pinocchio, where the wooden boy does not become a real boy. Tolstoy treats the wooden boy as already real. And I think that is our invitation today, to see disability not as an upending of capability, but as an invitation to potential and promising new ways of being with the planet. I want to end this way. By making sanctuary, I refer to attempts to create space for the new. I will not go into the architecture, the medieval architecture that I borrowed from to create this concept of making sanctuary, right? There were practices that might be understood as claiming sanctuary, where a fugitive rushes into a church and claims sanctuary. And once the accused was rehabilitated, no one could go and grab the accused. I feel we are now facing a refugee crisis. And these refugees are not human. These accused ones are not humans. They are like Paquita. They are invisible. They are molecular. They are microbial. They are more than human. The question of making sanctuary is, how will we create room for the new to thrive? Are we going to rush back into the normal? Are we going to resituate the familiar? Or are we going to open our jaws to accommodate this fugitive, the fugitive new that Deleuze and Guattari were all about centralizing? Are we going to stay with the monster, or are we going to kill the monster? Are we going to find ways of commoning in the cracks, or are we going to flatten the cracks all over again and long for a post-racial society as Brazil once did when it was an empire? Making sanctuary is the insurgency of the invisible, is the invitation to open up space and create a politics, an inquiry, an experimental aesthetics that accommodates the disabling, the monstrous, the unheard of, the unthought. And with that, I will end, and I've said I will end many times. Let me end with what I call the animism of the peri-feral, or looking away at. I've just told you about my son. His name is Kea. Marietta calls him Kaya, but that's also accepted. I loved it, a new pronunciation.
I'm so sorry.
No. Oh, please. We are people that embrace mispronunciations.
Absolutely.
Right? Mispronunciations are gifts to Yoruba people. So I take the gift of your mispronunciation, and it becomes a diffraction of the name that is never still. Okay, so no apologies necessary. It's a gift. There are two ways of seeing, right? Or grammatically speaking, you can look at something or you can look away from something. I call the way that my son often shows up in the world as looking away at. It's kind of in the middle of looking at and looking away from, right? It's a slanting of the eyes, just a little bit off track, off kilter. I've held my son up in my arms many times and tried to force him to engage me interpersonally. That's the clinical gaze right there. I'm trying to insist on his sanity. I'm trying to restore the semblance of the familiar. But my son, no matter how many times I say, Kea, can you look at me? His eyes drift just off my face And I think that this drifting is an ethnographical project, is an autistic politics. This making sanctuary is an autistic politics that is not about seeking clarity. It's not about seeking precision. Modernity is always about precision, arriving at the whole, arriving at the categorical, restoring the familiar, restoring the individual, restoring identity, restoring the normal. It's not about that at all. It's about losing our way gently and finding other ways of being in the world. I have a lot more to say about making sanctuary, but I think I'm a member of this family now, this Posthumanities Hub, and there'll be lots more to say together. But this has just been the opening remark, if you will, that is cradling this concept of making sanctuary together. I thank you for listening and boring you a little. Thank you for being here.
Oh, you did not bore us. Thank you so much. Oh, I'm going to see if I can find the buttons here. Yes. Thank you so much, Bayo. May I say, Bayo?
Of course,
Yeah.
of course, please.
This was absolutely marvelous. And I bet that everybody out there is like me, like bubbling with, you know, questions or thoughts or stuff they want to ask you. But can you hold that thought for just
Of
like
course.
a 5-minute comfort break, to use the wonderful term from Marietta, for leg stretchers and, you know, bathroom breaks. And is that okay? And then we just return within 5 minutes so that you can, if that's okay with you, Bayo, you know, have a lot of questions and comments and keep the conversation kind of going. So I thank you warmly again, Dr. Akomolafe, and we will see each other back in just 5 minutes.
So 43.
43, thank you, Maria.
According to
Yes.
this time zone.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Wow. Back.
Return.
Indeed. I bet many of you are texting and having like a little internal conversation. So thank you all for that. And of course, we can use this amazing Zoom function of what's it called? The chat basically, if we need to, you know, test things out in the written form before we dare to try it out loud. But I think you should really feel that you can test things out. And we have already tested our voices, so they work. Now, I would like to open for questions and comments.
So please feel free to raise your electronic hand. Or, you know, shout, but I mean, maybe electronic hand is easier to track down. Alex, that's a live hand, not electronic one, please.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Bayo, for the talk. It was, yeah, so inspiring. I thought a lot about the undercommons when you talked of Moten and Harney.
Ed Moten.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they talk a lot about fugitivity, as you did, and the surround, while you talked about the black outdoors, and I got this feeling of it being at least in the same space. But they are talking about the cracks as something already here in us at all times, as some a possibility.
Yes.
And you talked about the respond and call. I was wondering if in the cracks that you described, if you think of these cracks as calling out to us, or if we already are responding in a way, and how, or if we are calling out to the cracks, and this call and response between the cracks and us, or if the cracks is just a place that we have to go into.
Right.
Yeah.
I think of, thank you for that beautiful question, Alex. I think of cracks as I don't think of cracks as universal. I think cracks have skirts. Like every explosion has a radii or a radius of impact. Think of the Tunguska event in Siberia, right? The meteor smashes into the forest, fells hundreds of thousands, I think, of trees, right? Blasts bodies in the same way that Hiroshima has is more than just a localized event. It has gradations of intensity, right? And has impacted more people than others. The hibakusha are the ones that were more proximate to the blast, the explosion. Those of us who are spread out across space-time, away from that local event, are in a very molecular sense hibakusha as well, but not enough to be considered part of that political class. Right, so cracks are not universal. They have territories, and they present possibilities for acting and responding, and new ethical outlines are possibly traced within cracks. Having said that, I think we are almost always responding to cracks, even when we don't think we are, right? For instance, now you have carbon-14 in your cells. But yeah, that's all there is to it. You just know that you might know that as a fact, but it doesn't do anything, right? So whether by accident or by occlusion, we are always in response, always dynamically entangled with cracks. We're always being reformulated with cracks. Either we reinforce the familiar, or we soften it a bit, and the image crumbles into a compost heap, and then other things become possible. Those are the things that I feel are possible with cracks, that cracks re-engineer reality, right? They re-engineer continuity. The pandemic, for instance, has disturbed the outdoors. The outdoors is now suspicious. Social distance is the ritual we use to compose bodies and the spaces between bodies, right? So it has reformulated body ethnographies and identities in particular ways. And it has also led to a crystallization of power, right? An invitation to double down on epidemiological strengths, right? The nation state wants to reinforce its territory, and so it closes its doors. The United States is presently not accepting applications from India, and I think many parts of Africa, to fly to the United States. I don't know about Sweden, but nation states seem to be congealing and trying to reinforce their borders. So they're responding to this crack, in a sense, this event, this miracle out of the familiar. My issue, or my invitation, is that are there other ways that we can stay with this moment that will help us see differently? Are there other questions we can ask other than how do we save the world? I don't feel that the politics of this moment should be devoted to saving the planet. I think that the invitation of now is to stay with cracks. And that is the possibility of decolonial futures.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for not only your theory, but speaking to us in such an inspirational way, so we can engage with it.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you.
Thank you so much, both. You see, the next question's from Simran, and I think that since we have, sort of not extremely much of time, I will just let myself read it out loud. So I hope Simran can bear with me. Right, so thank you for an amazingly insightful talk. I have a question. What would this sanctuary be like for you with respect to the prevailing gender dynamics? When we speak of the post-human or the modern human, how does that interact with gender issues?
I was going to do something, say something about, I have a theory, I'm working it out, call it transraciality. And it's about how race is not a thing, right? Race is not a property of bodies. It's not a property of human bodies. Race is an ecological intensity that, let me put it this way, fellas. In the same way that Cecilia and Marietta, I'm sure you're familiar with the work of Theresa Brennan on the transmission of affect. Basically how affect, which is distinct from emotions, are ecological things. We don't just feel the world. Feelings are like territories that enlist us into them, right? They're like walking mountains, titans. in the same way I feel race and gender are more than human becomings. And some of the incarcerating dynamics we fall into is to try to restrict gender to individuated bodies, isolate gender from gendering, right? Or race from transraciality, or identity from nomadic becomings, right? We lose sight of how these things are not static and defined once and for all, that what it means to be gendered is still being worked out by a universe that is never fully in arrival, never fully made up. So a post-activism that is also in conversation with gender issues, also in conversations with racial issues, is a re-questioning or reframing or decentering, rather, I would go with decentering of the human, right? It's an explosion that throws our limbs, our gendered bodies, our racialized bodies across the terrain and asks us to approach them in a new way. Let me leave it at that for now.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much indeed. Do we have time, Marietta, for just one?
I think that easily we have time for one or two questions. So I think that, you know, if anyone would like to use this amazing opportunity, Gregory.
Yeah, if I can ask a question. One of the things I was interested in is how you see your relationship to the discourse of Afro-pessimism. Clearly, there's a kind of notion of this destruction of the world, the kind of no rebuilding the slave ship, no return to modernity. And you're clearly thinking also beyond that destruction or within it, right? There's a kind of, I don't want to say hopefulness or an optimism, but kind of speculative pragmatism about what do we do in the remains. And so I'm curious about how you see your relationship to some of those kind of discourses, from Afro-pessimism to someone like Catherine McKittrick, or you mentioned Fred Moten already. And as someone who works in affect, I was interested to hear you speak about affect. So that was great.
Right. Frank Wilderson's work with Afro-pessimism actually informed some of the things that I'm doing with post-activism. I can't see your face, by the way. It's kind of disconcerting because it sounds like God asking a question.
Hardly. I'm on, my camera's on. I'm not sure why you.
I think the gallery view maybe, you know, can reveal.
Oh, because I'm spotlit. Okay, brother, I hear you, and that's possibly enough. Putting Afro-pessimism in conversation with post-activism feels like, for me, I put it this way some time ago in an interview. It seems like, for me, an invitation to lose hope, right? The Professor Marisol de la Cadena, dear friend of mine, would say that Black bodies were not just brought into the new world, they were brought into the human. And the human is not just the anthropomorphic or physiological structures that we're used to. The human is a territory of acting. It's a way of terraforming the planet. It's a way of relating to space-time. It's an understanding of geometry, how our bodies are oriented in the world. And hope is part of that assemblage. The idea that we ought not to give up, brother, that we ought to persist and we ought to be resilient, I think has diminishing returns after some time, because hope can very well be part of the mechanism that sustains the Anthropocene or sustains the Capitalocene, this arrangement of bodies. So the way that I've been exploring it in terms of pessimism is, what are the resources or treasures that come with losing hope? If we treat hopelessness not as a dead end, as a black alley, you know, somewhere we drop off the flatness of the world, if we treat it as huitlacoche, but are you familiar with that delicacy from Mexico? Carolina is like, yes, Yes, indeed. I had it just a while ago. I haven't had with La Coche. But I like the idea of, and this is my notion of ontology, how the world is not categorical, how it spills and becomes other things, fugitive in relation to what it was prior. With La Coche is a disease that became a delicacy, right? It's a fungal pathogen infecting corn, and it becomes a delicacy, right? And then somewhere in Ohio, there's research trying to understand how the flu can cure certain cancers. I like the idea of a world that isn't still or categorical. So I'm looking at how hopelessness has actually been historically. If you study the Caribbean philosophers, Martinican philosophers like Edouard Glissant, they are exploring what they call he's late now, explored what some of them call bacchanal aesthetics. Bacchanal aesthetics, that is, in the shadowy places, in the places of despair, there is still life. There's still generativity. There's still growth after trauma, so to speak, what psychologists call post-traumatic growth. There's still energy and animacy and vitality, even in the heart and in the veins of pessimism. So that's how I'm putting them to work together, reading them diffractively through each other. I'm trying to explore how trauma is not just, for instance, a dead end or a pothole, but a portal, right, to other ways of being. How we often frame trauma as a political project, a civilizing project, blinds us to what else it is doing with our bodies. And so Afro-pessimism is like the cautionary wagging of the finger that we do not invest so much in continuity that we lose sight of the gifts of discontinuity, that there are cracks all around us, as Alex reminds us, that we can build a politics of the hypo-subject, to borrow Timothy Morton's terminology. We can build a politics of descent, of going under to where Bakita lies together. And what that looks like is going to be local, it's going to be archetypal, it's going to be ethnographical, it's going to be spontaneous. It's not going to be a cookie cutter blueprint that can be transported around the world. It's not going to be universal, but it might look like an aesthetics of the invisible, a way of attending to the invisible. Does that respond to the question in a way?
Fantastic. I'm thinking about, yeah, that was fantastic. That was exciting. I'm curious about an aesthetics of the invisible, and back to glissant and opacity. I'm curious about often that kind of invocation of opacity, which is a kind of way of, I mean, it's a powerful concept to think with, but I also wonder, I think it's McKittrick who says it's also in some ways avoiding some of the questions you're wrestling with, right? And so I'm curious about this invisibility and ways in which we think that in relationship to opacity, or even the notion of visibility itself. I mean, how do we understand that relationship between the visible, the invisible, and the opaque as a politics?
Deleuze did some work with that in parsing between a politics of recognition and a politics of invisibility, if you will, right? That I might tether to the apocryphal Chinese apocryphal sayings. Apocryphal because we don't know if they actually are Chinese, but some people say they're Chinese. They're curses, they say. 3 curses. The first one is, may your days be interesting. That's the first curse. The second curse is, may you be seen by the emperor. That is the politics of recognition, and it's a curse, right? May you be recognized. And the third one is the most cursiest of curses. May you get what you want.
Ooh.
May you actually get what you want, which already troubles the idea that desire and wanting and seeking and inquiry are not ours, so to speak. They are ecological things, right? How we want and how we desire and how we imagine the future, for instance, are often territorial enactments of capitalism, right? We think we're imagining a future outside of capitalism, whereas capitalism is deploying our bodies to reinforce itself. So a politics of opacity, a politics of refusal, a politics of going invisible, of becoming fugitive, is about building cultures, cultivating cultures, subcultures outside of recognition. And I'm not saying that it becomes a binary. I'm sure there are spaces of convergence and divergence, but it seems to me to be supplementary to a politics of recognition, an identity politics that seeks to be recognized. See me, my life matters. Black lives matter. Black lives do matter. But at the same time, we cannot fall back on that critique because we're stuck in an epistemology of recognition if we stay within that territory. I want to fly. I want my body to flower. I want to become unrecognizable. I want to become opaque to the systems that surveil our lives. And that calls for a different kind of politics today.
Great.
Wow. I wish we had like 2 hours more or something, but
Oh,
we don't. But we really don't. A warm thank you to all of you for attending and sharing your thoughts with us in this conversation, and a special warm thank you to Bayo Akomolafe for doing this together with you. What amazing storytelling powers you have. And okay, I'm going to save it for the little post talk that we have for 15 minutes after this. But there's a few wonderful things I want to talk to you about. I mean, this I want to ask you about, but I won't. We don't have time.
Do it.
I mean, if there is a kind of middle ground, the Swede in me want to ask, is there some kind of middle ground between the potential for restoration and the potential for decoloniality? Could there be minor solutions? Because I mean, you provoke me with issues around justice, as a gender scholar, and I love that, so thank you. But I'm also thinking around vaccines, for instance. Are they really working on an individual level? Aren't vaccines, working on a collective level? That they are working on our collective body in one sense. Yeah, this was some. You want to go? You.
Yeah, let me just dance with that a little, Cecilia. You've awakened something. I mean, the force of my rhetoric can be something to be wary about, because I might often come off as saying there are no solutions, or and I mean, Karen Barad has often noted that there are no solutions. There is only a way of becoming accountable to the moment as it shifts, right? And she's a dear friend. And yet, it's not that one would say that there aren't solutions, but there isn't some middle way between restoration and fugitivity. I don't know what a middle way looks like. And I don't want to, again, boundary these sentiments as if they were part of a binary. But it's an invitation to queer restoration just a little bit, so that it does more than just restore things, right? Because coming from the people that I come from, restoration is troubling, right? I grew up playing on the playgrounds that were the deposits of Western societies. When you guys pack rubbish and try to recycle them, the narrative is that it's actually being recycled and it comes back as new things, when actually only 7% of those things are recycled. A large percentage, 90-something percent, 93% of them comes to Nigeria, to Gambia, to Africa, and thrown on the streets, right? And then our feet, children, we flatten them on the ground and they become our playgrounds. That's the image of restoration. That's the image of continuity that often plays out. So when you talk about vaccines, for instance, I don't think vaccines are bad things. I just gave a public speech at the New School in New York about the unexpected gifts of stupidity. And I spoke about vaccines. Even if you say that they help at the collective level, collectivity is one iteration of individuality, right? It's still the paradigm of many individuals. It's still the paradigm of the human, right? And I'm not saying vaccines are bad. They're definitely not bad. I've been vaccinated, my family as well. I'm not saying it's bad, but I'm saying that it is rhizomatic. It is part of a political project that we don't often talk about. That seems to me to be aching to restore the controllable, the familiar, to get back to consumerism as we know it. Fly the planes, break the environment again, and then wonder at the end of the day why viruses are afoot, right? It seems like we're caught in this toxic cyclicity. So I feel vaccination is not enough, and vaccines have never been just vaccines. Vaccines are always vaccines plus something else. Vaccine plus the archetype of the individual, vaccine plus the nation state, vaccine plus. So there's lots more to talk about, but we're in the same family, and that's good.
Yeah, we are. And I mean, I'm in awe. Thank you so much, Bayo. And your clarifications helped me a lot. So thank you so much for that. And thank you, all of you, for being here with us. And if there were to be some, not final words, but words to think with continuously, it is, of course, stay with the trouble, but also stay with the crack, right? Thank you all so much for joining us. And I hope to see you next time.
Yes, thank you so much. So stay tuned. And I think that now we can stop the recording.